The moment marked a serious turning point in the war strategy built by Benjamin Netanyahu. What had once been presented as a confident display of military strength suddenly appeared to expose a major political and personal vulnerability. Reports circulating inside Israeli leadership circles described an alert that quickly triggered concern within the cabinet, representing the type of situation the Prime Minister had long feared during his time in power. Inside the secure communications center beneath the military headquarters in Tel Aviv, the atmosphere reportedly changed dramatically. The facility that normally operates with constant activity appeared unusually quiet. Chairs were empty, phones were silent, and for the first time in many months of ongoing conflict, the leadership seemed unable to fully control the narrative surrounding the war. The intelligence screens that usually display live battlefield information were suddenly showing something far more alarming. Iranian state media began broadcasting footage of precision missile strikes targeting a complex in northern Tel Aviv. According to several sources, that same location had hosted a meeting between Netanyahu and members of his closest security cabinet not long before the explosions occurred. Soon afterward, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps publicly claimed responsibility, stating that their forces had successfully targeted what they described as the operational headquarters connected to Netanyahu. At that point, Israel's government was already dealing with significant pressure. Public approval inside the country had been weakening. Tensions with Washington were rising, and military objectives across several fronts were becoming increasingly difficult to achieve. Yet the shock went beyond the physical strike itself. What followed was a powerful information wave that rapidly spread across international media, shifting the global narrative. For a leader whose political strength had long depended on projecting control and confidence, losing command of that narrative carried serious consequences. Observers began examining what might have happened in the period leading up to the strike. Reports suggested increasing divisions inside Netanyahu's inner circle, while financial markets started reacting to the possibility that Israel could face political uncertainty. Some analysts argued that the situation might represent more than just another escalation in a regional conflict. For Netanyahu personally, the moment could become one of the most difficult crises of his political career. The leader who built his reputation on promises of security now faces pressure from multiple directions, including diplomatic isolation, internal criticism, and an increasingly complex military environment. Around 18 months earlier, Netanyahu had stood before Israel's parliament and made a promise that would shape his legacy. He assured the public that his military campaign would restore full security and strengthen Israel's deterrence power. His strategy focused on demonstrating overwhelming force, removing threats across several fronts, and proving that Israel under his leadership could not be challenged. He predicted the campaign would move quickly, Hamas would be dismantled as a military force, Hezbollah would be neutralized along the northern border, and Iran would eventually be pushed toward negotiations under the pressure of Israel's military strength, supported by the United States. He also promised families of hostages that their loved ones would return home by Passover, and told reservists that their service would last months rather than years. However, the consequences of the strategy soon reached far beyond the battlefield. Relations with European allies began to weaken, and tensions with the administration of Joe Biden reportedly grew as warnings from Washington were ignored. Diplomatic progress built over decades with several Arab nations started to erode. Even within the United Nations Security Council, countries that had traditionally supported Israel began stepping back from their usual positions. Inside Israel, experienced military commanders and intelligence officials started warning that the operation was expanding beyond its original goals. They argued that global criticism was intensifying and that economic pressure was beginning to affect Israel's technology-driven economy. Some quietly urged Netanyahu to consider a ceasefire proposal that American diplomats were attempting to arrange through private diplomatic channels. Netanyahu rejected those suggestions, insisting that critics failed to understand the seriousness of the threat facing Israel. He argued that traditional approaches to limited conflicts were outdated and that the country needed a complete transformation of its security strategy. Confident that history would prove him right, he believed international outrage would eventually fade and that domestic support would remain strong if the final outcome delivered total security. But that assumption may have been mistaken. During the early hours before dawn, Iranian missiles were launched from multiple locations within a short time span. Israel's advanced air defense systems intercepted many of them, but missile defense works on probability rather than perfection. When enough projectiles are launched with carefully timed coordination, some will inevitably break through. Witnesses later described flashes lighting the sky near Yarkon Park before powerful explosions echoed across the city. Emergency calls reported a large blast in a government district and heavy damage to a heavily secured building without public identification. Soon afterward, Iran's Revolutionary Guard issued a confident statement claiming that their precision strike had successfully hit a command center used by Benjamin Netanyahu and his war cabinet, suggesting that high-value individuals might have been present at the time. As events continued to unfold, it became clear that the strike and the information campaign surrounding it were only the beginning of a far more complicated and unfolding crisis. As emergency teams scrambled to reach the strike zone and Israel's military sensors activated lockdown protocols, the Prime Minister's security detail executed pre-planned evacuation measures designed exactly for this type of scenario. At the same time, multiple crises erupted simultaneously across Israel's governance and security apparatus. Even as missiles were still in the air, financial markets in Asia, which had just opened, reacted instantly. While Tel Aviv's stock exchange is usually closed on Saturdays, global derivative markets, which set sovereign debt prices, never sleep. Just minutes after Iran's announcement, Israeli government bond credit default swaps surged by 27%. Traders from Singapore to Dubai watched as algorithms calculated a simple equation: political instability plus military vulnerability plus international isolation equals default risk. Meanwhile, a secure line between the Pentagon and Israel's defense forces went silent, not due to technical issues but because U.S. officials were ordered not to respond until the White House National Security Council could verify who was actually in charge in Tel Aviv. The leak that would embarrass the Prime Minister most came from within his own government. Less than 20 minutes after the attacks, a cabinet minister sent a text to 23 Knesset members with just 4 words: "He is inside." Markets don't wait for official confirmation. Crude oil futures jumped 11% in under 6 hours as operators calculated the impact of a nuclear-armed state's leadership being directly threatened in one of the world's most strategically sensitive regions. The stakes were not just political, they were economic, global, and immediate. Inside a secret bunker, top Israeli officials convened at 4:10 a.m., where Howe and He, including the defense minister, foreign minister, finance minister, 3 senior military commanders, the Mossad chief, and Shin Bet's internal security director. The question on everyone's mind was unspoken: where is the prime minister, and who is actually running the country? The defense minister asked directly if there was any visual confirmation of the prime minister's location in the last 30 minutes. The answer: a tense silence followed by a careful confirmation that confirmation is being established through secure protocols, spoke volumes. Normally, in a security crisis, the Prime Minister would be on a video call within minutes of an attack. The fact that confirmation was still being established 45 minutes later suggested one of 3 possibilities: Netanyahu was injured and managing public perception. He was in such a secure location that communication was technically complex, or a severe breakdown in the chain of command had occurred. The cabinet analyzed months of mounting international pressure, failed military objectives despite 14 months of intensive operations, plummeting approval ratings, and political fractures. They realized the missile strike had created a moment of uncertainty they could exploit to force a transition long feared politically. A decision was made. If Netanyahu could not demonstrate authority publicly within 6 hours, emergency protocols were activated, temporarily sharing executive power with the defense minister to maintain command continuity. The Iranian strike was not aimed at killing Netanyahu, but at demonstrating Israel's vulnerabilities. It turned military superiority into a political and psychological trap, shifting power away from the prime minister and signaling to regional actors that Israel's dominance could be challenged. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, all were watching closely, reassessing alliances. Netanyahu's leadership, long built on the image of strength, security, and indispensability, was unraveling in real time. His own cabinet met without him to discuss authority. His closest allies hesitated, and international support wavered. Decisions would become increasingly erratic, and any misstep could trigger political collapse. A coalition divided between ideological hardliners and pragmatic centrists cannot simultaneously pursue aggressive military campaigns, maintain global legitimacy, preserve economic stability, and uphold public morale. The missile attack was the spark, but 18 months of isolation, miscalculations, and overreach created the tinder. Now Israel faces a critical 72-hour period where the next moves could determine early elections, a unity government, or a crisis unprecedented in its history. Where Netanyahu is and who truly controls decision-making is no longer speculation. It is the central concern for leaders in Jerusalem, Washington, Thrawn, and across the region. When leaders stake everything on force, that very force can reveal vulnerability. Power doesn't fade slowly.